and get started. Thank you much. Everyone who's on the call today, welcome. Welcome to League of Women Voters Lincoln-Lancaster's Lunch and Learn. I'm Terry Hendrickson, your host. I'm followed by a great committee of folks who puts together meaty and interesting subjects each and every month. We're really expanding. I just want to acknowledge to everybody who's here, who has joined, and to maybe those we can send a message who can't join. A lot of folks are without electricity. They can't log on. They can't charge their phone. There's no air conditioning. I've spoken to a few folks today who say, well, we lost all our patio furniture pads and we have a trampoline in our backyard and we don't own a trampoline. So it's a little crazy. I want to give special thanks to those who are joining today as speakers because, you know, there's been a few trials. We have a very busy special session that's kind of rocking and rolling. We wanted to try to get a midstream update. So we're doing that even though our conditions aren't perfect. So this is our What's Up down at the special session. For League of Women Voters. We are joined today by Rachel Gibson, who is our Vice President of Action. I think I have that right, for our Nebraska League. She's joining under duress. She gets extra kudos. Also with us today to give their insights on what's unfolding, Jillian Linster with the Center for Rural Affairs. And today we are also joined by Lisa Schoenberger, who is substituting for Rebecca Firestone with the OpenSky Policy Institute. All these people lean in really hard to what's happening. It's an unusual time when there's a special session. So let's get to some of those things. I think we'll
have a special session to undertake something.
We will plan to have questions
dealing with
posed in the chat. We will ask those who are speaking to please monitor the chat so we can get to questions as we go along. Normally we wait till the end, but we're going to be asking questions of our speakers as they're talking to us today. Rachel, would you get us started, please? And thanks again for being with us.
Yes, and thank you for all the coordinating behind the scenes. I very much appreciate it. And Lisa, thank you so much for stepping in. First of all, thinking of everybody has damage or is out of power. Your neighbors are here to help, so ask if you need it. So, well, my name is Rachel Gibson, as you probably know, and I am the Vice President of Action for the State League. I would love to have Dr. Linster and Lisa introduce themselves real quickly and just talk a little bit about your roles. And then we'll do a quick overview of where we're at with special session. And then we'll dig into some questions. And I just echo Terry that if you have questions or comments or things you want to know more about, drop them in the chat. I would love for this to be a useful conversation. So we want to know what you want to know. So with that, I'd love to have Dr. Linster introduce herself.
Thank you, Rachel. And hello to everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Dr. Jillian Linster. I serve as the Policy Director for the Center for Rural Affairs. I've been with the center for a little over a year. They have been part of Nebraska politics for over 50 years. We're doing a lot of important policy and advocacy work for the rural communities in our state, of which, of course, there are many. I oversee a team of 16 policy-devoted staff at the center. We are most heavily focused in Nebraska, but we also have a strong showing multiple staff over in Iowa and engaged with the State House over there. They are lucky enough not to be in special session right now. And then we engage lightly in our other neighboring states of South Dakota and Minnesota, where we also have staff on the ground. So having that regional policy work gives us some really helpful context for understanding what is going on in the state of Nebraska in particular, and looking to some other models and examples and ways of doing things that are still relevant with our neighboring states. Our policy work covers a range of areas, but our main focuses are on clean energy, agriculture and conservation, rural development and health and family well-being. And we engage with partner organizations around the state to be offering policy advice and insights from the rural perspective on all of those issues.
Well, thank you. And I realized how serendipitous this is because a big part of this conversation is about property tax. And a lot of that is tied to agricultural approach and also school funding, which is something that Lisa is very familiar with. So Lisa, would you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me again. I am pinch hitting for Dr. Firestone, who is stuck in hearings all day. So you get me on this call. So I have been with OpenSky for very little time. I started on July 10th. Heck of a time to start working at a fiscal policy shop, that's for sure. I serve here as the communications director. So have been very busy just sort of getting my hands wet in this. And I think what Rachel is alluding to also, I serve on the Millard Public Schools Board of Education. So I have a pretty huge stake in sort of what comes out of this from the school funding perspective. And of course, it's impossible to untwine that as it sits right now from the issue of property taxes in Nebraska. So really watching this from several perspectives. Our team has offered insight on all of options on the table. I think in the Nebraska legislature there's often things that come in via amendments. There are a few shell bills out there. So certainly additional proposals could be unveiled. I think what's really important to remember is that this is just such a complicated and meaty issue. I think if it were really easy to just sort of come in and do property tax relief, somebody would have done it many years ago. So there is a great deal of sort of respect and reverence, at least from our organization, on all of the different levers that need to be adjusted here and how they're going to affect another area of the state. And what we've heard really loudly at listening sessions from people that we speak to is just the real commitment to maintaining local control and maintaining high quality K-12 public education in Nebraska. So yeah, happy to be here and be part of the discussion. And yes, I will put my contact info in the chat as well. If anybody needs anything, at the end, feel free to reach out. We're happy to provide talking points, research, any of those kinds of things as people, prepare to sort of advocate on behalf of your district with your representatives.
Perfect. Thank you. That was such, like I said, this is serendipitous that these two perspectives are here today. And I want to, I think you both hit on really good, important point that property taxes and schools are innately connected because of the way we've always funded our schools. I also want to reiterate, because sometimes those get pitted against each other and they are not necessarily in opposition. So I think that's something that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that's something that the three of us would argue that there is middle ground and it's not a one or the other type of situation. So with all that said, we're going to go ahead and jump in kind of bigger picture here. I'm going to share just a little bit about special session first, and Dr. Linster, Lisa, jump in whenever if you'd like. So some of you may be familiar. For those who aren't, a special session can be called by the governor. And what that is it's when something comes up outside of our regular legislative time, which is usually the spring. The governor can call a special session to bring everyone back to work on a specific policy issue. And he has a proclamation that says this is what we're focusing on, and they're supposed to stay within those guardrails of the specific things. They're not unheard of. We've had special sessions before. Most recently, we had one for redistricting. And the reason was because the census data was late and we could not do that during regular sessions. So we had to have a special session. Before that, there have been a couple called related to budgets. And that's because halfway through the year, we did not have the revenue we thought we were going to have, so we needed to make some adjustments. There was another one about rules and regulations regarding to pipelines because there was some building happening. So these aren't totally unusual things. However, I will say that to have such a big undertaking as addressing property taxes and having it be in such a we must get this done right now situation is a little unprecedented. So that's the context of the special session. I would love to kind of highlight the main three bills that really the governor is driving this, and he has three main bills he's focusing on, but I want to pause to see if Dr. Linster or Lisa, there's anything you'd add about just like special session in general? Cool, I got it. All right. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
That was great. Yeah, no, I think that was a great summary.
Fantastic. All right. So as I said, the governor is really the one behind this who really has pushed to reduce property taxes. And he initially said he wants to reduce property taxes by 40%, which is a big amount. And as you know, in Nebraska, we do have high property taxes. So this is an issue. But he has been working with a group of folks to put together a proposal of the way to do that. And the way that is manifested is in three specific bills. So LB 1, 2, and 3, and I'm going to post the fiscal notes for the first two in the chat to pull up. And the reason I'm posting the fiscal notes is because this is the clearest place where you can see what money is going or being taken away, and what things are being addressed in taxes. So these are the first two. So LB 1, remember it's a package. LB 1, which is brought by Senator Linehan on behalf of the governor, is the tax portion. So we need to find some way, if we're going to cut property taxes, money has to come from somewhere. So the governor's response has been to take away a lot of tax exemptions that have accrued over the years, in addition to upping some sales tax on things. So really the idea is sales tax is where we're going to get that money from. So that's the first bill. And if you click on that first link there, there's like 80 something different things that are now no longer going to be tax exempt. I was particularly struck by that this morning because one of them is repairs to house and car. So previously there would be no taxes on that. Lots of people will be facing those repairs, and there would be a tax on that under this plan. So glance through that. The second bill, LB 2, is from Senator Clements on behalf of the governor, and this is a proposal for budget cuts, and there are a lot in there, and we're talking big dollar amounts, like 10 million in public assistance, and they are across the board. So there's cuts even to the functioning of our legislature. So the people who, the clerk and the people who write the bills and staffers, that sort of stuff. But there's also things for like public safety and behavioral health, just a really wide list. So you can see that in the second link there. The third link, which I'll put in later, I don't have up right now, which is LB 3. And this is from Senator Clements again, on behalf of the governor. And this is actually making cuts to our current budget. So the one I spoke about previously, that's in the future, we're cutting these amounts. The LB 3 is in addition to the cuts that happened this spring that were a little unusual to do halfway through our budget year. There's even more cuts or moving of money from different funds to project a certain picture of our fiscal situation. So those are the three bills that the governor that's the implementation of his plan. I will say that there's mixed feelings about special session from the senators, and the governor's proclamation touched on a lot of different areas of tax code. And so senators said, great, if we're going to talk about tax code, we're going to talk about tax code. And there have been 80 bills introduced from other senators, all somehow related to taxes. That was not anticipated. So that is another piece that we're kind of juggling with here is there are now a bunch more bills that need hearings and how do those fit in and that type of thing. So that's the context of special session. I'm going to stop talking because I talk a lot. Dr. Linster or Lisa, would you add anything to that before we jump into some more specific questions?
No, the only thing that might be interesting to add is that LB3 also reduces our current cash reserve. So that has been eyed as like, idle money. Smart budgeting practices, in all political subdivisions, but really even in private businesses and things along those lines, do really include a robust cash reserve for economic downturn. I think, of course, you hope that doesn't happen. You hope that the state stays economically healthy, but it's very unusual to deplete a state's cash reserve in times that are economically prosperous. And so that I think would also be a relatively unprecedented move. It is also not an ongoing source of revenue. And I think that's where, as OpenSky evaluates these various proposals, one thing that we're always looking at is this proposal funded by a predictable, consistent source of revenue that we can count on year after year, that we can model, that we can understand, that we can then communicate to other political subdivisions as far as budgeting, those kinds of things. In the school world, we're not looking at just 1 year at a time. The legislature, does a biennium budget. We are negotiating contracts with teachers, for 3 years in most cases. So it's very difficult to sort of plan and model things when we're doing these like cash fund sweeps. It's almost like we're looking between the couch cushions of the state and trying to rustle up some additional money, which of course only gets you so far. There is a point where you run out of sort of surplus funds, if you can even call them that, in order to fund ongoing expenses and those kinds of things.
That's such a good clarification, Lisa. That's I think it's part of the tricky part of this is it's getting so in the weeds of tax policy. It's even more important to listen to folks who it directly impacts or work in these areas and really understand the nuances. Which leads me to ask Dr. Linster, is there from a working in the rural community and that advocacy piece, what are some of the things you're seeing in this that potentially are good or potentially you're concerned about? I mean, from your expertise, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I really appreciated what Lisa added there as well. And I think it's worth, just reminding everybody that the upcoming regular 2025 session is already a budget year. And so we do have that opportunity in the relatively near future to address budgeting concerns on according to the, regular schedule that the, other kinds of school budgets and things would be more in line with. But I do see some really good things coming out of this. It's been striking, I think, the level of collaboration and cooperation that is happening, people reaching across the aisle in ways that we haven't seen as often lately. You've got Senator Erdman working with Senator Michaela Cavanaugh. That is, really amazing to see. Senators Slama and Conrad coming together. All of these kinds of like partnerships that, relationships that maybe have not existed in the past, and they're now finding opportunities to come together to address the problem. And I think that's the other encouraging thing here is that it is really universally recognized in our state that property tax is a problem. And so even though we see a wide variety of perspectives and ideas about how to address that problem, it is encouraging to see so many people willing to pitch in and bring ideas. And the record-breaking number of bills introduced here just shows you how engaged people really are on the issue. And a lot of the ideas that are being brought show some promise. I think that some of the things that worry me are how the sort of inherent rush of the special session, pushing this to happen outside of our regular schedule. I would also say that a lot of the bills that I'm seeing are either lacking in information or just kind of lacking in follow through. Like the planning is missing. We haven't had time to fully think about, here's this idea that we have for addressing property tax, but how is it going to work? How is it going to be executed? SB1 is a good example of this with a lot of the sales tax exemptions. If we're going to impose sales tax on some of those things listed in LB1, we've got to be able to figure out how, on a practical level that's going to work and think about who is going to be effective. So often what we're paying attention to in the legislature is not just what's the idea for the fix, but how are we going to execute it? Because often the pro or con decision comes down to the method of approach and not just the actual issue itself.
I think you highlight a really great point there of, again, the special session being an unusual place to undertake such a big thing, and also the creativity of things that really actually could impact. I was listening to Natural Resources this morning. We were talking about fish access and things like that. And there was a tie, surprisingly, to property taxes, but exactly to your point, it's a big thing to undertake. And I noticed that Nancy asked in the chat if there's time or space for additional items. I also think that that's a piece that's sort of hanging over this legislature, because there has been conversations about things outside of the call of the special session. I think the one that has gotten the most attention is the winner take all, which is about how we award our presidential electoral votes. From what we're hearing on the ground, there's just no interest or time to address that right now. But there are some senators that's still percolating back in their mind, and there's some national pressure for it. So right now we're hearing that's not where people's mind is at, but that doesn't mean that it's completely off the table, because technically they can amend the purpose of their meeting, their special session, at any time. Now they formally have to, the governor formally has to do that. But there is always kind of that little bit of a door. So I think that also ratchets it up the pressure for a lot of our senators, which is just helps kind of put in context this really big, important conversation we're trying to have also has all these little tiny fires beneath it that we're trying to keep at bay. So thank you, Nancy. That was a great question. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat here, because like I said, I want to make sure we're talking what people want to know. One of the questions was about many of the bills being introduced as shell bills, and a shell bill is basically a vehicle that doesn't have anything in it, so that you can drive it to the floor and then put things in it, is kind of the way to think about it. Usually the life of a bill, as many of you know, it's introduced, it has a public hearing, it then can be voted out onto the floor, and then it goes through 3 rounds of debate. So a shell bill is basically, you don't have much to say in a hearing because it's saying this bill is empty until we figure out what to fill it with. So thoughts on the shell bill approach is that, I don't want to say a positive or a negative, but can you two talk a little bit about what that looks like, or have we seen those in the past? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I can chime in, and then Dr. Linster, please, by all means, round this out for me a little bit. So the shell bills in and of themselves are not terribly unusual. Typically what happens is the chair of the committee will introduce the shell bill and then fill it with other bills that have already been introduced and had hearings in that particular committee. So it kind of comes together as a package. So sometimes they become sort of what's called a cleanup bill with just a bunch of little like technical language things, updating references, those kinds of things. And they're not terribly, earth-shattering types of legislation, really just to clean up our statutes and make sure that everything is up to date. What I think is causing a lot of concern and alarm about the shell bills in this special session is that a completely new idea that has not been vetted and not been through the public scrutiny process that we really pride ourselves on as Nebraskans, that every bill gets a hearing, that everybody gets to show up and say their piece, that these bills will not undergo that vetting or the sort of rigorous engagement with key stakeholders, whether it's the schools, whether it's the ag trade groups, whether whoever it is, that they will be used for surprises. And I think an organization like the League that really encourages civic participation in education, I think it is very concerning that those could take the shape of some things like we don't want to rewrite the entire funding system for our public schools and slip it in a shell bill and just drop it on the floor without senators having time to model it for their particular districts, without them having time to talk to their stakeholders, without several different groups, and without even the Legislative Fiscal Office being able to do the diligence necessary to provide them with the information that they need on that bill. So I don't know, Dr. Linster, do you have anything additional to add on that?
No, thank you, Lisa. That was a great, summary of what we're looking at and how they work. I'll just say that this I think is kind of the big wild card in the week 10 days ahead of us, right? As we wrap up hearings this week and start to look ahead to floor debate later next week. In the meantime, the committees are really going to be crafting the bills and hammering out the details. And so we'll really be waiting to see what comes out of committee and heads into floor debate next week. Another thing that may be useful to mention here is to point out that one of the special things about a special session is the level of control and authority that the speaker has. I mean, he's always in charge of running the debate and the processes, but he has extra authority in the special session, more control over how things are done. So a lot of responsibility lies with him to kind of orchestrate that process, and we'll be watching that closely as that debate begins later next week.
Thank you. That was a well summarized. Yes, the bill, and I feel for the bill drafting office, because, you know, there's this group of folks who the senators say, this is my idea, and then people who this is their everyday job put that all together. So when they were thinking I'd have 10 bills and now they have 80, God bless them. So there was a quick question about in the chat about kind of some of the content of those bills, because we're moving at such a fast pace. There have been occasional pieces where there's something missed, or something is, you know, the math doesn't quite math. I was listening the other day, and it was wonderful because one of the testifiers came up and talked about massage therapy services. Last session were moved to a different definition instead of, you know, more of a cosmetology. It got moved into a healthcare. And so the people who advocate in that area caught that in the bill and said, we did whatever with the bill, just make sure that we're listed as the right thing. So I think to that question is that's also part of our job, and the folks who are lobbying to, you know, if we see something to say something, especially because we're moving at these breakneck paces. And I do think that once we get into the bills that are really the ones that are moving forward, there will probably be a much more fine-tooth comb looking at those, both from the public and from the poor people who probably haven't slept, the staff over at the legislature. So I'm speaking, go ahead.
Sorry, I just thought I'd also add the point about it's worth keeping an eye on the amendments that are out there in this regard as well. Many senators have already been filing amendments on bills that are not yet out of committee. And what that does is it gives them the opportunity to like officially suggest certain ways that the legislation should or should not be shaped. And so if the bill as it comes out of committee already, you know, negates the purpose for the amendment that's already been proposed, then the senator who proposed the amendment can withdraw it. But those amendments can already be in place as a kind of safeguard to protect against particular details of those bills when we don't yet know what they're going to look like.
That's a great clarification, especially when you look at the bill links that I sent. If you're looking at the breadcrumbs on the bill page, there's already like a million amendments and motions and things like that. And that is from a very strategic standpoint of different senators of how that will shape debate, what amendments will get, you know, added or even have time to be discussed. So that's a really great point to point out. I want to shift a little bit into some of the content type questions, or if people have questions about details of bills or hearings or things like that. And we'll start with this question from Kate. This is such a great Kate High question. I love it. Why do you think Americans for Prosperity testified against LB1? So LB1 was a fascinating hearing for those who listened. It lasted all day. And it was quite a diversity of folks who showed up. This is not exact numbers, but from my watching, it seemed that there were maybe a third of the testifiers who were in support and 2/3 who were against, maybe even a fourth, 3/4, depending. And those who were against were very wide. There were a lot of specific trade organizations or professional organizations that just totally ranged from insurance companies to distillers to different ag groups, because some of those tax exemptions were specific to their work and would have an impact, a fiscal impact. There were others that were bigger picture. I think OpenSky, I can't remember if they testified, but I know you guys have a stance on it. So organizations that are looking at the fiscal picture, and Americans for Prosperity is one of those. From what they were saying in the hearing, the reason that they came out against that is because it would really up our taxes, and it would inhibit some organizations and some companies from really being able to nimbly do work, and it's putting more of a burden on taxpayers. And their reasoning, though, is then the response to lowering property taxes is to rein in spending. So their argument is the problem is not it's not the taxes, it's the spending that we need to address. So that's different than some people who are coming in and arguing you know, it's not an issue of spending or of these taxes, it's that we cut income taxes. So there were a bunch of those are the nuances we're getting into. So my take was, from what Americans for Prosperity was saying, was raise no taxes, lower all the taxes, and change how we spend money. So that was my take. I don't know if either of you would add anything to that. Cool. I'm from Wichita. I'm very familiar with Americans for Prosperity.
Yeah, you know, somebody said earlier, it's very interesting, the alliances in some of these. It is not often that OpenSky and AFP come in on the same position on an issue. And like you said, we both had some different qualms about it this time, but you know, certainly I think the proportion and the voices against it made themselves known. That's for sure.
So this is a great question too, to put this in context from Claudia. How do and I'm going to expand your question a little bit, Claudia. How do our tax rates compare to others? And you two probably are much more experts than I on this. So I will turn that over to you and add anything that I feel like needs to get highlighted. But Lisa or Dr. Linster, whoever would like to start on any of tax rate, income, property, sales, go wild.
Go ahead, Lisa. Yeah.
I'm like looking at you. So I could get the exact numbers of sort of where we shake out in some of these. What's challenging is that we do have states that surround Nebraska that have zeros in some of these columns. You know what I mean? And so it's difficult to compare, you know, when some states have done different things. What I think is really important to note is that Nebraska, even just last year, this particular legislative body voted to make some very, very aggressive decreases in income taxes and to sort of narrow the bands of income tax brackets for people. So they saw additional revenue on the table that could have been used for property tax relief, and instead shifted that into larger investments in lowering people's both personal and corporate property taxes. And the intent was to make it a more business-friendly environment, and to make Nebraskans who are maybe older or you know, paying a larger percentage of their income remain in the state. It is not a unique idea. This has been happening nationwide. I think organizations like Americans for Prosperity are largely behind the drive for this. The Chamber of Commerce was also a big proponent of this, as they do advocate for businesses in the state. What we've seen in places like Arizona, for instance, where they had these very deep income tax cuts, coupled with another one of my very big passion issues, which is school privatization vouchers. It has completely decimated their state budget. They are making cuts to really critical things like water infrastructure. They are now unable to fix the air conditioning in their state prison system. And again, I said Arizona. I mean, it gets frequently very, very toasty in Arizona. I'd say they're probably setting themselves up for some pretty significant litigation with things like that. So we are far from the only state to have considered such a thing. What I think is unfortunate is that we haven't looked at other states to sort of figure out, hey, how has this worked out for them long term, even 2 or 3 years out. In many cases, you know, we have sort of the warning signs to what this looks like. So we talk a lot about our three-legged stool of property taxes, income taxes, and sales taxes. And honestly, right now, our stool is really pretty well balanced between the revenue that comes in between those three areas. Except those income tax cuts will hit this fiscal year that just began in July, and we sort of sawed that leg off a little bit. So now we're trying to figure out how we rebalance and how we can sort of figure all of that out as we are trying to lower property taxes, as we're trying to saw a little bit more off of another leg. So I think it's that particular thing is really complicating this issue when it comes to a lot of this. The governor has said in LB1 that his intent is not to introduce any new sales tax if there is a surrounding state that does not also tax that item. I think that's very difficult. Of course, we are here in the middle of the country. We have many surrounding states. many of our surrounding states have different landscapes as far as tourism revenue, as far as, natural resources revenue, those kinds of things that look very different from Nebraska. So how we stack up and how we sort of move along those things really kind of varies state by state. We do have one of the higher property tax burdens. That is certainly the case. And I think that's why we're all sort of bought into this idea that we need to do some meaningful work to lower that. But I don't think that the stool is as unbalanced as people might lead you to believe in some of these things when you really look at pen to paper.
Yeah, that was such a great overview of that. And Dr. Linster, would you add to that?
No, that was great. And I think that three-legged stool analogy is really useful in thinking about balance and the way that these things shift around, right? Because it does come down to simple math at some point. If you cut all of the taxes, then there's less revenue, right? The other thing I'll point out, though, is when we're thinking about these three taxes in relationship to one another, from like a political science standpoint, sales tax is considered a regressive tax because it taxes the consumer equally regardless of income. So if there's a 5-cent tax on the thing that you're purchasing, you have to buy that, whether your income is $50,000 a year or $500,000 a year. And that is one of the principles then that ends up reinforcing inequality in a society because of the taxation that is not proportionate to income. And so that is just another factor that is something to be mindful of when we talk about increasing the excise tax.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one of the things that we also heard yesterday was a lot of the legislators are approaching this as we're just looking at property and sales. Like that seems to be in their minds the only thing we can talk about. And there were several folks who brought up, wait, let's actually take a look at that income piece because that is the third leg of the stool. And when that bill passed, it's a step down. So we'll be in the first year of the step down of that, but we've got a couple years. And so, for example, one of, I think it's Senator Rabel's bills, there were a couple different bills that approach this, but I believe Senator Rabel said, let's just press pause. Let's press pause on the income tax cuts, see what this shakes out to look like for a few years, and then, adjust as necessary. So there's some senators who are open to that idea. My sense is those mostly leading the charge of the governor's plan, that doesn't feel like as much of an option to them. At least that is my sense, but that is part of the conversation. And I think that's where they need to hear from people. If you feel like the three-legged stool is out of whack, which leg needs attention. We're getting really into this analogy. I apologize.
No, that's okay. I think the other thing just to add to is that sales taxes are one of the least stable taxes out there. Funding essential services like schools, like police, fire, those kinds of things by sales taxes is a very risky move for a state, for a political subdivision to take. In economically lean times, you'll see craters in both sales taxes and income taxes as, the job market sort of crumbles, as people just buy less, those kinds of things. Property taxes, as much as they are a frustration for many people, are one of the most stable revenue sources that we have available in Nebraska. So the shift does introduce some anxiety for those of us who set budgets for political subdivisions to think, what happens? Like things are great in Nebraska right now. What happens when things are less great? Which inevitably happens. This is economics. There are rises and falls, and things that are beyond our control. What happens if we sort of put this on such an unstable source of revenue, and where does that leave us? What options might we have at that point, and what might we not have?
And the proposed sin tax increases that are part of LB1 is a great example of that, right? Because it's been proven in other states that when you crank up the tax rate on some of these things, it does change purchasing behavior. When cigarettes cost way more, fewer people buy cigarettes, but then that means that the state's revenue from taxing cigarettes goes down. And if you're depending on that to pay for something like Lisa was explaining, now you've got a deficit.
That's so funny. My younger brother works in the liquor industry in Kansas. I saw this and I was like, oh boy, you might be seeing some vans coming now to fill up when they come down to Kansas City. Because that was one of the quote unquote sin taxes, what people sometimes identify as like, well, these aren't things you should be doing by someone's definition. So pop, soda, distilled liquor, those are all listed in here. Some of them in a really significant increase. Okay, want to make sure that we get to the questions here. All right. There's one question about rising property tax increases and asking if there's, so when you, if valuations, how valuations fit in that. Because, for example, in my school district, our levy, the percent at which we're taxing, has gone down the past few years. That was a very thoughtful decision of our organization, our school board. The total number of taxes I'm paying is going up because the value of my property has been, they've said, actually, your house is worth this much, it's worth this much, and it keeps going up. So the tax rate may not look that out of sync with some of our neighbors, but our valuations are so high that the number coming in is much higher than what we actually pay. So I think that's an excellent question. And there have been some bills in the past to try to address that, how those assessors are set up, who can review those types of things. I'm not getting the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's as much interest in looking at that piece of it right now. I think it's much more focused on the other pieces, but that's how valuations play into all of that. Related, can we talk a little bit about caps? Because that's another conversation that's come up a lot. And it's just something I knew nothing about until I really started digging into this. So if either of you would like to explain what setting a hard cap is. Such a fun question, I know.
That's definitely one I would have been looking to Dr. Firestone to maybe summarize. She's great at that kind of thing. I don't know, Lisa, can you channel her, or do you want me to? I mean, I'm here to help.
You bet. Yeah, you bet. Please add color commentary here. So the concept of hard caps takes a different form in several different places. There are assessment caps, which I think Rachel was just kind of talking about, which says, hey, your property can only grow in value by this much each year. There are levy limits that says, hey, you can't set your levy above this amount unless you go out to your public and they give you permission to do that. There are also spending limits. Your total budget amount can't grow above this particular amount, from year to year. Most of those exist already, especially for our K-12 schools. And I think, Rachel, you kind of alluded to that being the largest portion of your property tax bill, which it typically is here in Nebraska. Schools are already set at $1.05 is the maximum levy. That does not include bonds or capital expenses like construction improvement, those kinds of things. And a school board can ask their constituents to vote to override that authority. That override is in place for 5 years. The board can then elect to use or not use any portion of that particular money. So in Millard, we passed a levy override in March of 2023 and have not used a cent of it because of additional investments from the state through last year's things. So it's not necessarily a given that you're going to be like, all right, here's my credit limit, let's go, you know what I mean, and max that out. I think that's still up to each individual board to work within the parameters that they're given. The hard caps that are being proposed are more aggressive limits on things like year-over-year revenue growth. And what's difficult is that meeting the needs of the students that show up at your doorstep changes year over year. Nebraska in general is seeing a pretty large increase in English language learners. English language learners have a different resource need than students who speak English as a first language, and that's the instruction that they learn in. Nebraska has seen a larger increase in needs to support students' mental health across the board. There are additional expenses that of course, we want to be able to meet students where they're at and to provide the services that they need in order to learn and access their education that they're guaranteed by the Constitution. So the costs are not getting slimmer. Additionally, I think everybody can really relate to the idea that we'd all like to see our teachers make a little bit more money. I happen to be married to one, so maybe that's a little bit of a personal ask, but teachers are part of a labor force that is another commodity and another thing that we have to look at when we're talking about schools. There is a national teacher shortage. We will need to figure out how to meet that moment and how to make sure that we're able to compensate teachers to keep them in the profession and to attract new people into the profession. The numbers of enrollees in education programs in our state college system and university system are declining as well. So the difficulty of meeting the needs of the students that show up on our doorstep with hard caps is going to put schools in a very, very difficult position. And what I think you might see is the programs that are sort of beloved and that a lot of people really benefit from, but that aren't necessarily those core things. So I will give you an example. In Millard, we have an early college program. So last year, 25% of the kids that graduated from Millard South High School graduated 2 weeks before that with their associate's degree from Metropolitan Community College through a partnership we have with them. That saved their families tens of thousands of dollars in those first 2 years of college. And some of them went straight to the workforce to start contributing and being tax-paying citizens. And then some of them, of course, went on to a 4-year or beyond degree. Those are the types of programs, and I'm not saying like specifically in Millard that would be, where we would go first. But what I would say is that we would have to start considering those things that are outside of sort of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and figuring out whether those are sustainable long-term, given aggressive spending caps on top of the caps that we already have in place. I think the same, like, I don't know, Dr. Linster, if you want to talk about even cities and counties and municipalities and how some of that might affect them, and the carve outs that they have and what they don't have, and, those kinds of things. I don't know if you had additional things to add.
No, I think Lisa, your explanation was wonderful, and it stands as an explanation of how it works in all these different ways and levels. And I would just echo the importance of maintaining local control. That's so often the problem with the caps, is that it's taking the power and flexibility away from the local people whose lives are affected by it, who know the most about the unique local situation, and who it's suggesting it's taking away trust, right? It's not trusting them to take care of their own communities, and that is often frustrating.
Okay, I hate that I have to slow us down here because I want to keep asking you 2 questions. I thank you so much for both of you being here. I want to touch on a couple questions that related to the public involvement, and I'll turn it over to Terry. First of all, it sounds like there's interest in this. We will look at potentially hosting something else. It might not be on a Thursday at noon, but the league will definitely talk about this and see if we can do some updates through session. Bigger picture, there's some questions about, does public comment matter? What should we do? Things are moving too fast. Amen. First step, yes. Public discussion, comment matters. I think the most important thing you all can do is talk to your friends and family about these things. Some people don't even know this is happening. And like I mentioned earlier, maybe the storm is a great place to start. Hey, did you know in the governor's tax plan, there's more taxes on repairs? However, you need to start that conversation. So talk to friends and family. 2, talking to your legislator does make a difference. Talking to other legislators makes a difference, particularly with this issue. In sitting in that revenue hearing, it was a room full, frankly, and no offense, because I am also a registered lobbyist, of lobbyists. And so it's very hard to cut through. So you need to reach out and let them know, remind them of the citizen behind that, use specific examples. If your senator is not responsive, email one who seems friendly, or email the committee that is hearing this. Last piece I'll say on taking action is I've dropped a couple links in the chat. One is OpenSky. If you haven't signed up for their emails, please do. They've got a great bunch of information. If I don't understand something, that's the first place I go. I also included the link to Center for Rural Affairs policy area. Fantastic way to dig in. That's a lot of stuff I am not familiar with, so that's great. And then finally, I put a link in there to sign up for an action alert. I follow the legislature and send out action alerts to league. You don't have to be a league member, but I send those out. It's turned into nightly for this session because it's going so fast, to basically say, here's the hearings tomorrow. Here's the link to submit a comment. or hey, this is what's coming up next, and here are the senators you need to talk to. So if you have an interest in that, you can go to that link and sign up. Again, you don't need to be a league member. So, all right, Terry, I want to keep talking, but I won't. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. This is going super well. I'm learning lots, and it brings up more questions. Just a couple things for league business. I have dropped a piece in the chat that invites you all to consider joining. I want to tell you especially that we have a lot of voter registration activity that we're focused on, and we need more of our deputy registrars. So by checking out our website, you'll be able to find out more about that. And also, did you know today is National Poll Worker Day? So if you're interested in helping promote democracy, get in touch with your local election commission and volunteer to be a national poll worker. Finally, I will say that there is lots happening at the legislature. We plan for the months of September and October to be talking about the ballot initiatives, of which we have myriad number. We'll be doing that these next two first Thursdays of September and October. So please mark your calendars for September 5th. That'll be our next Lunch and Learn. And let's go to the top of the hour with more questions and answers from our experts who are participating in the process. Thanks again, Dr. Linster and Lisa and Rachel. You guys are terrific. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for having us.
Sweet, we've got 7 more minutes. All right. So big picture, would just love to give each of you a couple of minutes to just share anything that you really want this group to hear, whether that's how to engage, whether that's a policy issue we haven't talked about yet, whatever you'd like to say in the last couple minutes here.
You can go ahead, Dr. Linster. You can start.
No, you're fine. I'm trying to think. We've talked about so much good stuff. What haven't we talked about that I would want to mention? You know, nobody knows what is going to happen in the weeks ahead and with the rest of this special session. This is, even for a special session, a truly unprecedented way of doing legislative business. So we're all watching things closely. But I think that's also another maybe place to remember that because nobody knows what's going to happen, it means we as residents and voters have the ability to shape it. And so that's just another plug maybe for, making your voice heard. Senators really care to hear from their constituents. They want to know, and the committees want to hear from Nebraskans as well about the particular bills in front of them. So I would just reiterate the encouragement to contribute to the process, and thanks, Rachel, for sharing all those great resources in the chat. I think everyone here has raised these great questions that everyone's looking at the right things, asking the right questions. Everybody's trying to figure these things out. Even the senators are trying to figure the things out. I saw quickly in passing, somebody asked about the governor's, motivation, what's really behind this. And I think that's maybe unfortunate that there's no way for us to actually know what is really the intention here. But it is really good that people are wondering and thinking through multiple steps ahead, because that's what we also need to be encouraging the lawmakers to do, to see the issues from multiple perspectives, and to think about not just what happens next, does this save this many dollars, but what's going to happen further down the road.
I think that's great. And, one thing that I would add to, as somebody who advocates for, our rural communities, I think it's just really important to remember that Nebraska is an incredibly broad state. There are school districts that you would not even believe are in the same state. There are, just a broad variety of needs of communities, that have undergone natural disasters, communities that have a great deal of wealth because of, some particular company deciding to locate there. This state is very difficult to have any kind of a one size fits all policy that's going to be successful for everybody. So somebody asked about, taking the funding for the schools. I think it it assumes that every school has the same needs, has the same community resources, has all of the same things. And if we could just give them the same amount of money, that they'll have the same results. And it just really isn't the reality of Nebraska. It really isn't the reality of education. And so I think this idea of kicking things back to local control, and I promise that I'm not just saying that as a school board member, I'm saying that as somebody who really just values the democratic process. My children are educated in the district where I serve. I have skin in the game. This is a really deeply personal thing to me, to create a school environment that will continue to be a really great place for them to be educated and the kids that will come after them. And so I think it's just really important that we continue to keep our eye on the ball when it comes to local control, and when it comes to the people closest to you making the decisions that will affect the things that your day-to-day life the most. I have people come up to me in Hy-Vee and, let me know how they feel about things. I can't necessarily do that with my legislator. I know a lot of people, especially in the larger districts in Western Nebraska, can't do that with their legislator. So I guess if I could give like one takeaway, the local control is more than just a talking point. It's really your voice and your participation and your stake in this process. And you hold those folks accountable every 4 years through the election process, or 6 years in some cases. So that's just really key to kind of keep in mind. This is your legislature and your process, and sometimes it feels very out of your control, but don't forget your ownership and your agency in this process as someone in Nebraska.
What great kind of wrap up approaches. I really appreciate that folks working on the insides agree that it does make a difference for our senators to hear from citizens. It sounds like there's a lot of interest in this, so I will we'll figure out another session. Again, it may be at a different time that we can kind of update folks. Every regular session, we have a legislative day, so perhaps we'll try to schedule those for some time when there's debate. If folks want to come, we can be down there and kind of help guide and be able to help people kind of cut through, because it can be an echo chamber. And so I think seeing citizens and having to look them in the eye would be helpful. So we'll do what we can to facilitate that. So Terry, I'll turn it back over to you.
This has been more than terrific. Please, everybody, watch the League of Women Voters Lincoln-Lancaster County website. It'll take just a little bit of processing time, but we will be posting this event on our website, so you'll be able to access the recording and share it with others. Invite them to join us each first Thursday of the month from noon to 1. We are adjourned for today. Special thanks to everyone for your questions and your great insights. We are adjourned.